lot of many interesting things happening, both as a builder and an investor, is the march of applications. I think enterprise applications, which are cloud native, AI native, data native, they're really inflecting with new JavaScript frameworks like Next.js. People just want to write applications quickly, but have applications use data and AI heavily and be able to deploy them anywhere. And what happens when application development keeps on inflecting, and it's both for fun, profit, and reduction of cost, is the pressure starts getting propagated down to the infrastructure tier. So for old timers like Raghu and me, who have built databases many times over, we always thought things were done. But as new applications come to the fore, new and creative pressure gets created on the infrastructure below data and AI. So it's a great time to work in data and AI, and hopefully we can share some insights around what we have seen in our technology journey, and then talk about what seems to lie ahead. So thanks again, Sayantan. I'll hand it over to you.
Sure. First of all, let's start with you, Pranav. You're in Flipkart, and in areas of data engineering and infra, Flipkart is managing so much volume. PhonePe is managing huge amounts of payments volume. What infra challenges are you seeing internally and with customers in context of this application revolution?
I think at this point, many of the consumer businesses, let's take Flipkart for example, they've reached a stage where the transaction volumes, the volumes of people who are reaching the application and doing something useful, it has grown tremendously. And the implication of that in terms of what can be done with that for the business is huge. And in order to be able to leverage that effectively, data is the link between what happens on the ground versus how the business decisions can be taken eventually to derive efficiencies, derive value out of it, and so on. Now think about tens of millions of actual transactions a day. Think about probably of the order of 50s and 100 of million users coming to interact with the applications. And when you come to an application like Flipkart or Ola or Amazon, you're not just interacting with one application. There are dozens and possibly more than dozens of applications with which each user is interacting, each of which is starting to generate data. So the volumes that we are generating for each of these companies and applications is starting to become very, very unreal. So the solutions that work for a certain scale start to break down as the scale changes by orders of magnitude. And it's quite obvious for most people here. But one of the challenges that any consumer business that scales to the level of degree that Flipkart and Ola and many others have scaled in India would be volume. Now, when does it become important? In my view, data is never your primary product. Your primary product is in solving a consumer problem. And that's where the entire initial mind share for most of the organization goes. You're trying to build a commerce solution or a mobility solution or any of these. That's where you're consumed by day in and day out. And data happens to be a byproduct for most part. Until you realize that in order to build your primary product, your byproduct is something that's the only path to deriving every last ounce of efficiency in your business. When you set up a warehouse from Flipkart's standpoint, early on, you can start defining your SOPs and processes and so on. And for a certain degree of scale, you can run it well. I'm told you can't hear me well. So is it better? Yeah. For a certain degree of scale, you can run it well. Until you realize that now you have dozens and possibly more than dozens of warehouses. And now you need to start the next 5 paisa per shipment reduction can only come from squeezing every efficiency out of your data. I think that's where people start realizing that the data stacks, they cannot remain just a byproduct. It starts becoming something that's absolutely essential. So coming from volume, the primary challenge for most scaling and growth and slightly largest businesses would stem from volume. leading quickly into costs and quality. So as you've evolved, what you also start realizing is that given that data historically has been your byproduct and not a primary product, consistency of data, canonical elements in this data in terms of where to look for information and what, partitioning of data into silos, lack of connectedness into data, each of these start playing a role to a degree that now you're playing a catch-up game. So to your question about what I've seen at Flipkart in terms of the evolution of data stacks, what would probably have been a good to have during the early growth days turns into something that's so essential that you are unable to escape from making sure that that's seen as something that's primary, that's dominant in terms of your future growth strategy. And I've not even come to the next level of applications in terms of what it can generate from AI and so on. The second part of this comes to cost. One thing that I learned as my journey through Ola, and some of my Ola colleagues are here who would probably remember that well, is that the unit economics in India is whatever it is. However, the costs are not scaled to the same degree. The cost of AWS infrastructure, the cost of any licenses you are buying, it's probably discounted for India, but it's probably discounted by 25%. It's not discounted 10x, which is where unit economics stand in India. Now, early on in your growth, the investments are fine, but pretty soon you come to a realization that now you need to start turning any application you're building into a real business. And that's where rubber meets the road. And you need to now start thinking about, while your strategy was great in the early growth journey, as you are going past your early growth journey, you need to now start thinking about how will you absorb the cost of 3 rupees per ride of infrastructure when your total amount of money you are making in your ride is about 10 rupees. So these questions become pertinent as you start dealing with the real unit economics with the cost of the infrastructure you're paying.
Thanks for that, Pranav. For you, Raghu, from your experience at Data Coral and from your experience with your customers at Data Coral, we would love to hear your views around what problems have emerged in the areas of data engineering and infrastructure, both for startups and for big companies.
Yeah, so Data Coral was, I guess I started it back in 2016. And the kind of problems that I was trying to solve back then was that there are plenty of companies, especially smaller companies, that were cloud native companies that ended up using several cloud services to actually build out their business. Now, turns out all of the data that they need to understand how their business is doing, to improve how their business is, improve their business, increase revenue, whatever else, all of the data was siloed in all of these different applications. And of course, there's the data that they're using to kind of power their own applications as well. So the challenge became that for somebody to understand how the business is doing, all of the data that are sitting in these different applications had to come together, right? And this became like, I guess Flipkart is kind of like a slightly older generation company, similar to, I guess, where I worked earlier, which was Yahoo as well as Facebook, where in most cases, everything was built in-house and all the data that we needed for analytics was available in-house as well. And of course, you had to put it into a single system, like a data warehouse or a data lake or things like that. But it was all just kind of built internally. But then in this newer companies that were becoming kind of more cloud native, you needed something that was simple enough that you could get all of that data into one place, which would be a data lake or typically a cloud warehouse. Like, I guess when I started, Redshift was really popular and then it was Snowflake. And of course, there's plenty of other tools that have been around that have come up as well that do data integration. And it does seem like even, and these would be companies in very different kinds of domains, right? As long as you're cloud native, invariably you had a data silo problem because of the sheer number of, I think there's some study back then that was like every company used like 50 tools to kind of build out their business. Now it's probably hundreds, I don't know, depending on whatever scale that you are in. So this problem has only gotten worse as more and more applications get used. And irrespective of we serve like verticals across the board, from kind of healthcare to kind of even technology companies to enterprise applications and so on. And I think the problem is only getting worse as you move forward. Although there are nowadays kind of newer things that are happening where people just want to build applications on top of their warehouse. They don't want to, or like there are applications that are getting built that are using a data warehouse as their backing store. So that means that you don't really have to do this whole overall data integration after the fact. Right? So that's something that seems to be happening kind of nowadays. What is the other part of the question? I forget now.
On the infrastructure side.
Yeah, so again, it's a matter of scale, depending on what type of a scale that you have hit. Initially, of course, for speed, you do want to be on the cloud, any cloud. Nowadays, it's even one layer above the cloud, which is, like I said, people are just building on top of warehouses. Even they don't even want to worry about what cloud you're working on. I guess everybody has heard all of the announcements that OpenAI did earlier this week. Turns out you don't even need a warehouse. You just kind of write English text and applications start falling out of that, right? So that's the world that we are in right now. But even there, if you need data that you want to use that is sitting in different places, you still need some way to bring it all together. So that's, I guess, going to continue to be the case. In fact, that's one of the things that I'm trying to understand where this area is moving as well. So.
We are, today, given this entire, and you touched upon this point, this is the age of AI. We are seeing an explosion of new classes of applications with the emergence of AI and, with Gen AI on top of it. First to Bhaskar, then to Raghu. I mean, both of you have worked with AI in the past. In the past with classical ML, previous wave of ML frameworks. What were the core challenges at the data and infra layer back then? And how are new requirements coming up with the emergence of LLMs?
Yeah, we'll probably come back to data platforms also. I think major part of operationalizing, I mean, AI or even like classical ML and then deep learning, as builders, for Raghu and me, I'd say, we were fortunate to be in companies where the top line was closely related to data and usage of AI, right? And that's why the companies like Google, Yahoo, Facebook, LinkedIn could spend enormous amounts of money in inventing in those tiers, right? So, and it was also early, I think, when Raghu and I started our careers at Yahoo and Facebook and LinkedIn, there wasn't that many cloud services available. Open source had just started, hadn't taken off. So this whole democratization thing around the data stack, the AI stack hadn't yet happened. Quite different from 15 years on. I would say for applied AI, multiple challenges. Of course, the usage of AI sits at the confluence of various personas in an enterprise. There will be a product. Essentially, if you ignore internal use cases, important profit-making use cases are about external use cases. Maybe you're optimizing a site, optimizing a user journey, and then if you go to like fintech companies, you're building models for underwriting. So, like the product manager personas are working with the product engineering personas, who are working with the data engineering personas, who are working with the IT engineering personas. So generally, democratization of AI has always been hard because there are multiple personas involved. That's number one. Number two is, if you look at right from the model building and experimentation phase to model refinement, refinement phase, all the way to the inference serving phase and then feedback loops, the journey of AI through an enterprise has many hops. It's not that trivial to build unified platforms which can operationalize everything. Just hard. And generally between model building and tuning time and model serving time, things are often different. The infrastructure below model refinement iteration is often a data lake. You're probably coding in Python. Whereas then you have to ship it to production and put it probably in a key value store. Your model has to be there. It's like Facebook, LinkedIn, Yahoo, all of us built key value stores for that. So a lot of the challenges around AI is around the fragmented nature of what I call AI lifecycle management. And if you click one level lower, I'd say just goodness of AI and models has to do with goodness of data that is feeding it. So if you don't have really good data cleansing pipelines, really good data models, you can't provide quick, correct data, clean data in an iterative way to your data scientists, to your product managers. Applied AI in enterprises are hard. So I'll just touch upon those. That said, there are all the Python notebook frameworks, then all the way to serving frameworks like PyTorch, development, the experimental phase development stuff like Pandas. These have democratized AI and kind of unblocked data scientists and product managers a lot. And there's a huge amount of progress there, both through open source, but also through companies like Databricks, offering, giving you like compute engines which are sitting kind of closer to the AI lifecycle management. Yeah. So I'd say a bunch of challenges around personas, around clean data, around feedback loops coming back from production to compile time, and around many personas. Those are some of the challenges. And we, I guess later in this chat, we can talk about Gen AI a little bit, but democratizing and adoption of AI inside enterprises is not a trivial thing. And I'd say we should have some humility in looking at, while we get excited about Gen AI, I think just thinking about in the last 10 years, if you look at verticals which have adopted AI heavily, they're mostly, I would say, insurance, banking, financial services, healthcare slowly. So essentially regulated industries are using AI in a very heavy way. And it's taken time. It's taken time for the stack to get unified, for the data format and pipelines to work. That's kind of one summary. The other summary is talent is a big problem in AI. Hiring data scientists, hiring AI engineers is incredibly difficult. And only companies like Facebook and, maybe, I'm a big fan of the Indian companies like Razorpay, PhonePe, Flipkart. Raghu was mentioning, Swiggy, Zomato, and others. And if your top line allows you to hire engineers like that, yes, you can hire it. I'm guessing these companies have hired very good AI engineers, but the corpus of AI engineers is fairly small. So I would say democratizing AI inside enterprises often is a talent problem. So I'll just leave it at that. And happy to take questions later on. Over to you.
Over to you, Raghu.
To be honest, I have not actually worked on AI. AI people have been my customers. Like, for example, when I was at Yahoo as well as Facebook, I was running kind of the data infrastructure side of things. And most of the questions that the folks building models had was, what's the quality of the data? And more importantly, what is the freshness of the data? So one of the things that I was talking to someone recently at Facebook, and he was like, yeah, all the algorithmic stuff is not where we think we'll get a lot of improvements. It's in the you improve the freshness of the data, or have like a much better understanding of the data quality. That is how we believe we'll get better results. In fact, one of the, I guess, a problem statement, if you want to take it on, is how can you kind of understand, or how do you compute model, or how do you understand model performance as a function of data quality? And how can you use that to improve the feedback loop that Bhaskar was talking about? I'd say those, even for the largest companies, that seem to be some of the problems based on whatever I've kind of talked to them about. Maybe you have seen these kind of playing out as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think bang on. There's a couple of problems in addition to that I've seen. Is it better? So I think one of the problems that you mentioned was about data quality and latency. Eventually, data needs to lead to decision making. And that decision making, both from business insights perspective and from operational efficiency, needs to be almost real time. What you realize is that many of the data solutions end up introducing a certain, like all the data is being generated by dozens, possibly hundreds of applications that are running in your cloud infrastructure. But each of these applications are only seeing a sliver of data. At some point, this data gets aggregated, some insights get generated, but usually there is significant lag between these two processes, ranging from hours in some cases to days. I think that's where a big challenge lies in what data platforms, data infrastructure is allowing people to do today versus where we need to be. And it's not like technology solutions don't exist for this. They do. The challenge is the person who's building your application, his primary thought is not about how this data is eventually leading to other types of decision making. A person who's solving for, let's say, user recommendations for a commerce application, or a person who's solving for pricing, search pricing in a cabs application, while he's solving his problem, the derivatives of the data that's being generated here, eventually as it gets realigned with all the other 50, 70, 100 applications in your enterprise, and then leads to an intelligence that a business person can look at. That's where you see plenty of handholding in data management, plenty of gaps, and eventually breakdowns. Many of you would know, I'm sure if you've seen enterprise dashboards, most of the enterprise dashboards are several hours delayed. Why should it be several hours delayed? Why shouldn't, as an Ola business driver, why shouldn't I know how many cab rides were done in last 5 minutes across India? All this information is in databases. How much revenue was generated in last 5 minutes? Why is it important? It's important because when something fails anywhere across my hundreds of applications, while that application can catch nuances of it, eventually it will start showing in my business results. And if I'm able to just watch my business results minute to minute, I will know something is going wrong and I can trace it back. Right now, I depend on localized intelligence in each application, something that completely breaks down the process of intelligent business decision making. I think the same holds even, it gets compounded when it comes to ML and AI-based decision making as well. What Bhaskar was talking about was your training infrastructure versus your inference infrastructure ideally needs to be identical, and it's not. You're training primarily in an offline model, whereas your decision making has to be real time in terms of some variant of streaming. Is your data quality so precise that you'll not find differences here? It should be. The gaps you find show up in business gaps.
First to Raghu, then to Bhaskar. Today we are hearing about the new data stack phenomena. In context of the evolution of the data stack, we have heard from the likes of Fivetran, DBT, data lakes, all the way to Airflow, data catalogs, and new paradigms such as data mesh. So would love to hear your thoughts and whatever you're hearing in the Bay Area on this.
I don't know if you had to start with like a history thing or in terms of things going in cycles, right? That's I guess the general gist. I guess back in the day when we were starting, everything was built in-house. So like I said, like we just have every piece of functionality that we built was built knowing what else existed in that stack, right? So you knew you just had to integrate with one thing and you're done. Now that became super rigid. And that was the reason why, I guess initially, so since about 2007 or 8, we've been trying to democratize data, by the way, like that's been happening. And we've gone through like several iterations, I guess. First we said we'll get all the data into one place and then we'll be able to get all of the insights that we want to get or like leverage all of the data. And then all the tooling around it, like the orchestration, everything had to be in one place, which was the data lake. Then the data lake became a data swamp and like people said, okay, we don't want to use the central thing or that we'll put a whole bunch of controls on it. And then it became super rigid. So then people are like, okay, now we are also moving in the cloud, so we want to move faster. And there, that is when the disassembling of the data stack started happening, and that was the the modern data stack. So you had like data integrations be like one set of tools, data pipelines be another set of tools, storage engines be a separate set of tools, maybe query engines also separate set of tools. And I guess the security side of it as well as like a separate set of tools. Now everybody now had like a tool integration problem, which is where most companies are now. Like if you are in the modern data stack, you're dealing with like maybe 10 plus tools. So now you have metadata tools like Acryl and like Atlan and those guys who are saying, okay, now we'll give you a central, like one layer that will tell you all the tools that you have for your kind of data. And then there is like the next set of companies that are saying, okay, now just have one layer. We'll give you one thing. Like I guess Mozart Data comes to mind for or Nextla. These are some of these companies that are saying you don't need all of these different tools. Just one is enough, and we'll do the overall end-to-end thing. So that's kind of where we are. So data mesh is kind of this interesting concept which does not try to either centralize completely or decentralize completely, right? It says you make your decisions on what technology choices you want to make for your kind of data, but then expose that data via APIs and call it a data product. So have a standardized API for the data so that people can discover it, they can kind of add security on it, they can query it, and data mesh goes into like a whole set of concepts and stuff. But that seemed to be the place where it allows for how much ever you want to centralize as well as whatever you want to kind of decentralize as a concept. Like something like this we had to do even at Facebook about, I guess, 12 years ago or so now, where it was for more of like a scale problem. We couldn't keep all the data in one data center because the data was too large. So we had to split data across multiple data centers. But then Facebook had gotten used to using data from across multiple teams. So we did come up with a notion of kind of data pub sub, right? So you'd have teams that are generating data and they're publishing them, and then other teams can subscribe to that data. And if that data turned out to be in a different data center, like the data infrastructure team had built automated replication and retention, and like there's a whole bunch that goes into it. So that seems to be the steady state for at least kind of data management, where whatever people want to, whatever technology, like it is the case that each team will want to come up with their own technology stacks, either because they're operating independently or they are through acquisitions or whatever else, like they have different kind of stacks that they have, different choices that they have made. So it seems like that is where the world is kind of going to go. I guess the new data stack, I don't know. He's the guy probably funding all of these new data stack companies. So he should, yeah.
I mean, a couple of points. I think, I mean, data has become more and more important in the enterprise and will only grow in importance, right? So if it is important for profit and top line, there will be demands around data. It's pretty simple. There will be many types of data, sources of data, personas using data. It's not going away. It's only going to grow. So, so obviously this diversity of needs around data and diversity of data itself is here to stay and only going to grow massively, right? So what will the business need be? If it needs real-time streaming data, well, good luck. It's really hard to build that stuff. So naturally, as diversity of data and diversity of needs around data has grown, the tech stack has grown more complicated, right? You know, you need to store lots of blobs, okay? You go use a data lake. You need to have a cloud data warehouse. Well, you can't scale it if you don't separate your compute and your storage layer. So you have to go use something like Snowflake. Well, you have to go, you know, scale your ETL tier. So you need something scalable, some scalable version of Airflow. Your Salesforce data is really important. So a company called Fivetran was invented, essentially to ship Salesforce backend data to the warehouse. It's as simple as that. And some random VC wrote a check, right? So fragmentation has come because of needs. The other driver has actually open source, which Raghu and I are both, you know, villains around and responsible for, that these 5 or 6 Silicon Valley companies, Yahoo, a little bit of Google, but majorly Facebook and LinkedIn, and then the second generation, which is Uber, Lyft, Airbnb, Pinterest, a little bit of PayPal and Netflix also. We've just open sourced a lot of stuff, which became a hiring tool. It became like this secular movement, right, coming from Hadoop. And what has happened is, as open source has grown, VCs have put in money, and open source projects for these specific parts of the data stack have become companies, and now they are exposed. Now the hyperscalers have their version of open source, and the company building the enterprise grid also has it, right? So there's been this secular investment of money coming from private, from VCs into open source, which has fed and created feedback loops in the craze for data. So that's not going to go away. It's caused trouble because through fragmentation, as Raghu pointed out. And Raghu also pointed out that at some point in time, an IT acquiring person will say, my goodness, I can't buy like 15 tools, man. I don't even know how to manage them. I'd rather buy 3, right? Such things are happening in security. I mean, JP Morgan has bought some 2,000 tools or something. I mean, something absurd. Data is not that bad because it's source of truth stuff. So I think complexity of data stack is here to stay, even with Gen AI. It's not going to go away. I think, let me step back for a second. I don't know, as Raghu asked, I don't know exactly who's in the audience. If you're a data infrastructure founder, we can have one conversation. But if you're starting your company and you have kind of had your first 50 customers, it's always a good idea to use a simple reference data stack. Try not to optimize stuff too much. And the streaming stuff that our friend here has talked about, stay away, man. It's really hard to build streaming stuff. Low latency feedback loops are really hard to do. And engineering problem aside, it has to map to a business problem. If you're not going to make 10x money by shipping data 10x faster, don't do it. And I don't see the need for small startups to do that. So I would say, if you're doing a company, fintech, insurtech, consumer tech, just have a very universally accepted data stack in mind. Use it so that you can leverage the community and know, what works, what doesn't work. That's one. The other thing is, whenever you're using data stacks, you should make sure that the data model that your business uses is very well thought through. Because ultimately, your data model is your business. And you'll see that reflected in every tier of the data stack. Anyway, these are some a few insights I could share in this limited time. I'll hand the mic back over to Sayantan.
I'll hand it back over to you as well, because you touched on AI. Would love to hear your thoughts first on the evolving AI stack, and what trends are you seeing in open source on Gen AI tooling?
Okay, so open source, as I mentioned already, if you look at ML deep learning, open source has been quite powerful. From Python Pandas to PyTorch to everything that Databricks has done. Coming to Gen AI, obviously it's a revolution which is here to stay. VCs like us are scratching our heads around which tier of Gen AI is VC investable. That's topic for talks we can have for 6 hours. But if you look at Gen AI and you look at retrieval augmented generation, you look at stuffing more stuff into the context, you look at the need for vector databases. Obviously, open source projects like LangChain, I don't know if Pinecone is open source, but Postgres is open source. So Postgres with support for vector DBs is a very important open source track. I would hazard a guess that anything around orchestration, so LangChain, Llama Index, all fill into this orchestration tier where you have lots of sources of unstructured data, documents. You need to bring them in, you need to make sense of it, you need to clean them, you need to build lots of entity stuff from it, and then ship it into, maybe you're querying a big LLM sitting outside, or maybe you're finding a model. Yeah. This whole orchestration flow is not a trivial thing. I suspect there will be open source platforms, LangChain and beyond, which will actually do something like that. I think the unstructured data tier, extraction tier, is still not a fundamentally solved problem. I suspect there will be companies around it, and open source will play part there. The other interesting thing about what I'd say in the orchestration and tooling for Gen AI is in the actual human-centered reinforcement learning phase, which can be quite complicated. And as I mentioned earlier, for even vanilla AI, multi-hop, very complicated hops where you're getting SME-based feedback loops. If you look below the covers of companies like Scale AI and Hive AI, what they build internally are very complicated orchestration engines, where humans sitting in Philippines and Thailand are actually marking stuff and giving it back to you. That's part of their secret sauce. In RLHF, I think we suspect there will be orchestration frameworks like that. So those are a few hints, but it's too early to tell. And for us VCs, we are all scratching our heads about. It's not just a question of open source. Is it actually going to be a business that will work? Will the hyperscalers generally win by building essentially cost-effective large models? We see one interesting thing for probably all of you to go look at is talking to established companies, friends in established companies like Salesforce, ServiceNow. I'm just talking about the enterprise software companies. It's good to talk to them. We see a lot of energy in traditional companies, all the way from Zendesk to maybe even Freshworks. I haven't talked to them. ServiceNow, all the people who I'd say own sources of truth in enterprise software, Workday included. Anybody who owns a departmental source of truth and has a business around it. We see a lot of activity in Silicon Valley in those AI products and orchestration teams. What sub-products they're building using Gen AI is probably very useful. I'd urge anybody interested in this area to talk to your friends there and see what tooling are they using. Is there a gap there? I'll just leave it at that.
Thanks, Bhaskar. Thanks for those interesting points. To Pranav, as Bhaskar was mentioning, one question we as investors always have, especially in the tooling space around Gen AI, that look, can an AWS or a GCP just come up and build this in the next 6 months or a year, and this business goes for a toss? So, first of all, would love to hear your thoughts that across Gen AI and maybe application that you've seen, do startups actually have an opportunity? And what trade-offs will someone senior in the engineering team need to make to actually make sure, look, do I want to work with a startup or do I want to wait for, let's say, an AWS to bring me a solution?
Today this space is so nascent that's very tricky to say what kind of applications would eventually emerge from that. The canvas seems pretty open right now, and you'll probably see many valuable applications coming out of it. Today, there's a lot of companies who are trying a lot of internal use cases where they want to use Gen AI. There are two challenges there. One is that of cost, and the other is that of talent. I'll come to cost first. Unlike traditional ML and AI, where training used to be expensive, inference used to be cheap. Those were applications you can pretty much deploy in a lot of different parts of your applications. If you're a commerce company or a mobility company or a food delivery company, in terms of finding personas, in terms of tweaking experiences based on specific use cases, you could deploy AI and ML models with very little cost because your cost of inference has always been cheap. That's not true with most of the Gen AI use cases. Here, the number of parameters and so on are so large that inference itself is becoming extremely expensive. You would have seen the challenges OpenAI is facing because of, in terms of turning that into a meaningful business model. Now, let's think about a commerce company like Flipkart. If I were to just write down the use cases that would make sense for a consumer coming into Flipkart and be led into finding the right merchandise, the right product to buy, and so on, you can come up with a million use cases which sound reasonable. The cost will be so prohibitive that you'll never be able to turn that into a real business. So my view is that we'll need to, as a company offering consumer applications, we'll need to think about what are the use cases which are pull-based use cases where a consumer has come in asking for some information, eventually converting into a transaction, where I'll be happy to spend money and turn them into real guided workflows and so on, eventually leading, versus push-based use cases. Because push-based use cases have low conversions, low CTRs, and spending a lot of money to just build applications around that will end up being prohibitive. So where do startups, which use cases will be solved by large companies like GCP and AWS and so on, and where will startups be able to play a role and help? I think it'll end up being in identifying some of the niches which allow me to build these pull-based use cases. Uh, an example of a pull-based use case will be customer experience. When a customer has reached me for asking for some information, there's plenty of opportunity to optimize from that point onwards. And there I'm replacing the cost of serving that call with something that's computational, quite possibly affordable. Can I power use cases which, when a consumer lands, let's say on the Flipkart homepage, when 50 million people are opening that homepage every day? I think the answer is going to be no. So in the end, we'll need to identify which use cases make sense at today's price points. 3 years later, are the price points going to change? I cannot foresee that.
Thanks for that, Pranav. And Pranav, at least in your, what trends are you seeing, at least in the engineering layer across data and infra? What trends are you seeing in core and non-core budgets, especially at Flipkart? And in the build versus buy decision when it comes to platforms around data and AI?
So Flipkart happens to be, as we just talked about, happens to be one of the companies which was slightly pre-open source era. I would say pre-cloud dominance era as well. So they ended up creating a lot of infrastructure, both for their cloud infrastructure as well as many of the applications pretty much in-house. And I think one of the challenges with building all of these things in-house is that at some point, innovation that applies to the entire world outpaces you quite significantly. While the costs still, there's still a cost advantage as long as you can continue to utilize your internal infrastructure well. The innovation that happens at a global scale is something that you will never be able to keep up with. If you're building your own data platform from scratch, I'm sure you can build it very well for the first 2 years, possibly for the next 5 years as well. But there's so much happening outside, because data platform is something that every company needs. And you'll eventually fall behind and start realizing that possibly the cost of building in real terms start to hurt you. So my sense is that let's not talk about a Google or a Facebook or an Amazon. They will always build everything for themselves. But for most other companies, sooner or later, if you're successful, if you last long enough, the cost of buying will always end up being cheaper than building it and continuing to build upon that perpetually.
Maybe I'll just add one dimension to it, which is that even in fairly large companies that have fairly big engineering teams, there'll always be some line of business, like it could be a marketing team or a sales team, that is not being serviced by the IT team that is, I guess, supporting the overall product team, right? So the lines of businesses are always looking out for new tools. Like this is how shadow IT kind of happened. Cloud kind of enabled all of that. So if you want to build some data infrastructure, then maybe go more towards lines of businesses. I guess I'll steal Bhaskar's terminology, the product geometry, and like, what is that? There's some three geometries that he talks about. Like you should probably just expand on that. I guess that model, I'll get better at remembering it, but I hope to use that as I start my next one.
Final question, last question to you, Bhaskar, and hopefully a very short answer. If you had to pick one area in data and infra that you want to invest in, or that you think will be a game changer, please, would love to hear your thoughts.
Don't do it. I'd say, data, having built data infra for what, 30 years now, and Raghu's been doing it for, it's hard. I would say online data infra, stay away. It's hard, too hard building source of truth systems. On the offline side, above data lakes, I kind of hinted at it. I think, are these going to become great businesses? I don't know the answer. Will there be needs as these new applications and waves like Gen AI hit us? Surely. I mean, I mentioned some stuff around unstructured data. I would say there will always be needs. The question, if you're a startup founder, is you should have a systems and kind of more database internals and kind of infrastructure background. Otherwise, don't go into it. But even this offline data lake, data analytics, AI infra area, if you want to do a company, make sure that you can answer the why now question. There should be a massive secular pull and need for some tier somewhere. Otherwise, don't do it. That's one comment. The other is data infra is really hard to sell top down. If you want to do a data infra company, I would ideally recommend you think about doing an open source project which sees adoption where there is a bottom up movement. Those would be my two comments other than the jokes. True founders will never listen to a VC, so that's the good thing. So just because I said something won't work, ideally it will work, but yeah.